Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Space for Faith podcast. I'm the podcast host, Matt. So I want to explain what this podcast will be. And the vision I have for it is to be a platform whereby through the interview of others, sharing some of my own thoughts, we can explore the intersection of faith with the fantastic, for lack of a better term. There's a lot going on in the world today, but one of the things that I find the most interesting are the revelations surrounding the UAP, or unidentified anomalous phenomenon topic. Historically, growing up, for me anyway, the UAPs were actually referred to as UFOs, but because of a variety of reasons, that terminology has changed, and I'm not going to take the time here to catch you up on the reasons for that, but I will offer some suggestions to catch you up on the whole topic, depending on where you're at. Now, I started by indicating that this podcast was going to be about bolstering faith, and I mean that sincerely. We're going to talk about UFOs or UAPs, or other phenomenon, futurism topics, perhaps, including, one of the things that I think about with regard to the future is the likelihood for more integration of cybernetic type devices into the human body. Right now, Mr. Elon Musk and the Neuralink company are creating devices that will allow interfaces directly to the human brain. And, who knows what will come of that. And presumably there would be other companies in the world that would be experimenting with similar technology. And so then, this goes back to the question of faith. And faith, I think in general, tends to be a very conservative influence in the lives of many people around the world. We hold to faith, generally faith in a God that keeps us grounded to our spiritual and cultural beliefs. And I think that that faith and our spiritual and cultural beliefs are sometimes challenged by the development of technology or the discoveries we make in science, or the discoveries we make. I say discoveries in science, and sometimes I feel like that has to exclude things with regard to the unidentified aerial phenomenon topic, but those aren't mutually exclusive. I'm of a faith that all truth can be circumscribed into one great whole, and therefore I don't think there's a reason to delineate between truths discovered in any topic of interest versus truths discovered specifically in science. You don't need a scientific lab to determine all truth, but certainly science plays a part, and hard sciences play a part in helping us to discover the world around us and what is true about it. So, I plan to interview guests, and I'm hoping to bring on guests that will be from a variety of different faiths. My goal is to strengthen faith in God generally. I personally believe in Jesus Christ as the Savior of the world, and my goal will be strengthened faith, my faith in Him, and hopefully others also. But I certainly don't want anyone who is not Christian to feel that this podcast is not intended for them, because it still is. I still feel like this topic of how faith intersects with these futuristic or modernistic topics and discoveries is relevant for anyone who's a person of faith and is seeking to maintain or bolster their faith in the face of the onslaught of new knowledge. So the question would be, what led to this podcast? What led to, or this in my life where I'm choosing to do a podcast about the intersection of faith and the fantastic? Well, I would have to admit that there are some things that I'm learning about in modern society that are sometimes challenging to reconcile with my historical and personal beliefs about God and Jesus Christ and their gospel. And so, for instance, I'm currently reading the book UFO of God by Chris Bledsoe. And if you're not familiar with his experiences, you could certainly read about him online. He's been on a variety of shows, including The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, and it has been referenced in other UFO documentaries that I've seen. And then, of course, he has a book that he's just recently released and is a bestseller. He grew up Christian, and I believe that he still is. And I think that he purports that these experiences that he's had have been angelic visitations. And I'm not saying that they are or are not, but some of it is confusing with reference to historical beliefs surrounding, Christian principles or dogma. For instance, he references a vision that he experiences of someone he refers to as the lady. And my question would be, who is this being? Assuming this being is real and the experiences that he's having are real, who is this being? I'm not finished with the book, so I don't have a spoiler alert from that regard. Some of you may have finished the book, and if he goes on to explain who he believes the being is, I haven't gotten there yet. But that's the type of challenges to faith that I'm referencing. In addition, another topic for consideration that I think is challenging to faith would just be the idea of, what is going on with regard to the alien abduction phenomenon. I recently finished the book Communion by Whitley Strieber, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. For those of you who grew up in my time, when there was bookstores, like, you'd go to a bookstore or a library for that matter, and there would be books set out, and even though you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, I remember being terrified by the cover of the book Communion. And for many years, I would avoid looking at that image, and I never read the book. But recently I decided that I need to go ahead and do that, so I did. One word would be horrifying, interesting, confusing. I'm not in any way doubting the experience that Mr. Strieber presents in his novel, but I just wonder what does it mean for the rest of us? And many people have claimed to have these experiences. David Jacobs and John Mack, who are both preeminent in their field of psychology and psychiatry, respectively, had done intensive personal research into this topic and published books and papers about this phenomenon, and certainly came to believe that it was true for themselves. So what is that? How does that play into a Christian faith or faith in anything where you believe in a God and you think, some of the thoughts that I would have would be like, why would God allow this? What is the purpose of this? Are these beings God? Are they sent by God? Are they an enemy to God? And so these are the types of questions that I have, something I intend to explore with this podcast, and I hope that you'll find it an enjoyable journey with me. These are complex topics, and I think it'll be interesting, and I hope to engage with thought leaders from various faiths and disciplines. The plan will be to delve into different topics such as futurism, UAP phenomenon, spirituality, alien encounters, and science. Depending on where you're at with these topics, some of the books that I have read, which I would recommend, and I would like to say that I have no affiliation with these authors, and I have received no remuneration for these recommendations. They simply have provided insights to me. These are the books that I think of when I think of books that I have read that have both challenged my faith and stirred my imagination and curiosity regarding these topics. So there are several books. One would be the book Witness to Roswell by Tom Carey and Donald Schmidt. Now, I want to go back and say that years ago, I remember reading and hearing about the Roswell incident from a very young age. In fact, when I was a young man, probably a child, I remember one time my parents and I were traveling with my family, and we were somewhere in a hotel room. I don't even remember where we were, but I just remember that presumably because we were in the hotel room, we had Showtime, and there was and I think it was the Showtime special, Roswell. So we watched this movie about the Roswell incident, and I remember being just, I don't know how to even describe the feelings that I had, because, you read these things or you watch this movie and it's like, is this fiction or nonfiction? It's being presented as nonfiction. It's being presented as something that actually happened. And yet, I personally can't verify it. Which is really it's a difficult thing sometimes to reconcile in your mind rationally. Why would people lie about this? If they are lying, what is their motive? If they're not lying, then it's an amazing thing, but I don't know whether to believe it or to choose to believe it or to choose to dismiss it. Well, when I was in college, I read a book by Carl T. Flock about Roswell. I'm sorry, I can't remember the title of the book. It was something about the will to believe. The book basically kind of goes through and analyzes some of the stories surrounding the Roswell crash, but it also examines the testimonies and, to be honest, I mean, I think it does examine the character of some of the witnesses, in which some of the character of the witnesses was in doubt, and so then I think some of the testimony is in doubt. But in the end, he concludes that it was classified because it was Project Mogul, which the U.S. government claimed, I think in 1994, if I remember my dates correctly. They came out and said that there was an incident at Roswell. It wasn't a weather balloon as we had purported in 1947, after initially saying it was a crash saucer, but rather it was Project Mogul, which was a top secret technological device, not a weather balloon, but a balloon that would carry a microphone into the ionosphere, because evidently if the Russians were doing nuclear weapons or thermonuclear weapon tests, they could actually detect the sound of those tests in the ionosphere. The reason that this was so highly classified, according to Mr. Flock, and also I think just rationally and logically, is because it would terrify the American people to think that the Russians were developing thermonuclear weapons. And there was really a Project Mogul. I don't think that's in doubt. At the time that I read that, I was so grateful, because I thought, well, this puts this entire topic to rest. I now, I felt like I had come to a knowledge to understand what really happened at Roswell and why it was secret, and why were there varying stories about it. So I actually wrote a letter to Mr. Flock through the publisher. I just sent a letter to the publisher. I never got a response, and actually, unfortunately, found out that he had passed away before I wrote the letter. But I wrote a letter to him thanking him for writing the book and doing the research. And I thought, this was a mystery that I always wondered about, and I appreciate it. Well, fast forward, and this topic, I don't know why it came up again, but I started wondering about it again. And so I ended up reading Witness to Roswell by Tom Carey and Donald Schmidt, and my mind was blown open again, and I just realized, wow, I don't think the case was closed on Roswell. I think that there is still a mystery there. I mean, they have hundreds of witnesses that have gone on record saying that it was not a weather balloon, and it was not something of this earth. And so read the book. Don't take my word for it. Other books that I would recommend, and we live in such an exciting time with regard to unidentified aerial phenomenon. Ever since Mr. Blumenthal and Leslie Kean wrote this article in the New York Times in 2017 about the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Special Applications Program, or I don't know, OSAP. I don't know if I got the acronym correct there, but I know that there was this article that talked about how the U.S. government was studying unidentified aerial phenomenon. And we also had the release of videos that were deemed, unidentified aerial phenomenon. We don't know what they were, but they're actually recorded on military equipment, doing things that are unusual with no identifiable traits like wings. The aircraft don't have wings or heat signatures indicative of normal thrust from like a jet engine. And so it's an exciting time to live, because we actually have a lot more coming out about this that they, at the very least, suggest that there is a mystery. As soon as Lou Elizondo's book Imminent came out, I read it and enjoyed it thoroughly. He purports that the Roswell crash was real, and actually states that there was 2 objects that crashed about that time. I also would recommend reading UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record by Leslie Kean. And I would also recommend reading her book Surviving Death, A Journalist Investigates Evidence for an Afterlife. That was another book that challenged some of my beliefs and was really an interesting read, and a difficult read from trying to think of the right word. One of the things that, David Grush and others who are whistleblowers about the UAP topic have indicated is that potentially part of the reason that this historically has been kept a secret by the federal government or military contractors is because of the concern for ontological shock. I think if I've experienced ontological shock in my life, it would be related to this book by Leslie Kean. A very interesting book, and I do suggest for someone that's really curious and is willing to have their paradigms challenged, that if you have not read the book, I think it would be one to read. Another one is, of course, Communion. I did end up reading that and enjoyed it, but it is scary and difficult to rationalize. Why would this happen, and what is the purpose? And it just goes back to Dr. Jacques Vallée, the French scientist who's been exploring the UAP phenomenon for decades and is probably one of the preeminent names in that field, has talked about how there's an element of absurdity to the phenomenon, that it may not be just a nuts and bolts craft from another planet with people from another planet. And I think Communion by Whitley Strieber has a similar vein, where there's a consciousness aspect and a confusing aspect, where this is like not communication between a species that knows our language, but it's more like a difficult communication between very different beings that the translation is not perfect in. And then I also recommend reading Hunt for the Skinwalker by Colm Kelleher and George Knapp. Now, George Knapp and his role in modern day ufology, there's so much that could be said about that. He's the one who broke the story about Bob Lazar and Area 51 in 1989. But that's like, in my mind, that's the least of his contribution, really, because George Knapp, in terms of the modern day research that he's done, both with Jeremy Corbell, and I think that probably he contributed with Lou Elizondo and to Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal's article in the New York Times. I don't think he's a listed author, but I just think that some of the things that George Knapp has done and reported on he's been playing a part in that has been absolutely instrumental to getting us to where we are in the field of unidentified aerial phenomenon today. So that's an excellent book, Hunt for the Skinwalker. Also a very frightening read, to be honest with you. It's a great book, and it's very interesting, but there are also just ontological shock moments in that book where you're like, what am I reading? Like, do I actually believe this? This is presented as though it really happened, and yet this is as crazy as any science fiction book I've read, in terms of these things. Like, this is like a fantasy book, but they're not saying this is fantasy, they're saying this is real. And then, of course, The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, the series on the History Channel, deserves special note, because that's a documentary about that ranch and its oddities and anomalies that were studied by Robert Bigelow under a government contract, from my understanding, and then also currently by Brandon Fugel, Travis Taylor, Eric Bard, and the team at Skinwalker Ranch today. And I mean, if you're not watching that series, I would really encourage you to do so, because I think it will change your mind about a lot of different things if you're very skeptical. And I think it's very well done and very interesting. I recommend Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, which is also by Colm Kelleher, George Knapp, and James Lukatsky. And then I recommend reading Dreamland, an autobiography by Bob Lazar. And I recommend Secret Machines, God's Man in War by Tom DeLonge and other authors. There's several books in that series. I've read the Secret Machines books, and I've read one of the God's Man in War books. It's so interesting that you just like Tom DeLonge is involved in this, but he's evidently been very interested in the topic for many years, and because of his fame and his curiosity, and I think probably because of his trustworthiness, he's been given information by contacts within the government that have led him to have he said some very interesting things in the past that I would like to know more about, and if pie in the sky dream, if this podcast ever became big enough that I could get an interview with Tom DeLonge, that would be incredible, because I'd like to understand a little bit better some of the things that he has said, and also some of the ideas that he has purported in his books. And specifically, like one of the comments he had made as I understand it, and maybe I don't want to misquote him, and perhaps I'm wrong, but my understanding is that he once said that something he had been told kept him up for 3 nights in a row or something. It was just such a shock that it was occupied his thoughts to the point he couldn't even sleep for a few nights. And you want to know more about that, like what can be that big of a shock. And I really think, when I pull back, and I think the 30,000 foot view of this topic is that something's going on, and I don't know exactly how it fits into my worldview. Truth is truth, and I'd want to learn to identify the truth. And I don't know how well I can do that as a limited human that I am, but I want to try to come as close to the truth as I can and understand as well as I can what is really true and what I can really put my faith in. So with that idea, there's a series in the faith that I belong to called Lectures on Faith, where it talks about faith, and it used to be part of the main curriculum of the organization. From what I understand, it's not considered to be like scripture, but one of the things that it teaches is that you can have, faith is faith, but you can have faith on true principles or faith on false principles. Like I could look out a window and say that a ship in the distance is moving, but it may actually be that I'm on a ship that's moving and that ship is anchored. You know what I mean? Like sometimes our paradigms and perspectives are incorrect. So we might have faith in a belief that's just not accurate, or perhaps our perception is just off. But Jesus said that if we had faith as a grain of a mustard seed, we could command a tree to be cast into the ocean, or a mountain to be moved, as I recall from the New Testament. And scriptural scholars are probably like rolling in their graves right now, or because I probably misquoted it. But the idea being that if we really had faith, if we just had a small amount of true faith, we could probably do more than what we're doing. And so I think there is value to having true faith and developing true faith. And in addition, with regard to this podcast, I feel like there are intimations in things that I've read and ideas that I've had, and I'm not setting myself up as a light. I'm not teaching this as it is necessarily true. I'm just suggesting an idea that I think may be possible, so called a prediction. But I think in the future, I think it will be more difficult to have faith in God and faith in Christ. I think there may be things that come out where people seriously question or lose their faith. But I don't know that that's actually necessary or desirable. I think we just need to figure out how to put our faith in the correct things. And so I'm hoping that this podcast can help me and others to do that. So in upcoming episodes, we'll have guests from diverse backgrounds and to discuss how they reconcile faith with challenging discoveries and claims, with the goal to bolster faith and acknowledge spirituality as a defining characteristic of a healthy human. So I've said a lot today, and this is just the introduction to the podcast. I will probably do some episodes where I simply share some thoughts, and I think that I'll share some thoughts from a blog that I have. So if you're interested in reading my blog, there's no advertising on it. I'm not making any money off the blog, but it's UAPactionplan.com. It's all one word, all lowercase. UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. So UAPactionplan.com. And my goal with that blog was initially just to encourage people to reach out to their elected officials. I'm an American. I live in the United States. So I feel like we can take part in the governmental process and communicate with our elected officials that we desire certain things and hope that they'll respond to that desire. I've contacted my elected officials from time to time, encouraging them to be, for there to be transparency on this issue. And I encourage anyone who's listening to this podcast to do the same. It's absolutely within our right. And, we don't have to make bizarre claims. We just can simply send in a message to our elected officials and say, look, this is something we find interesting, or something we find, I really think it's concerning from a security standpoint. Are we safe in our homes at night? Are we safe? Do we know whether there's life on other worlds and they might be visiting this planet? Is there an element of the government or a deep state or military contractors that have this information and haven't released it to the general public. And there may be good reasons that it hasn't been, but I worry that some of it may have simply been because of a remnant of the Cold War and the national security state, as Richard Dolan talks about. So anyway, my blog is uapactionplan.com. Please check that out, and I'll probably do some podcast episodes where I talk about some of my posts, and then we'll also have some guests on that will talk about their faith experiences. I hope that you've enjoyed listening. I know this is just an introduction, but I really encourage any of you that might be hearing this to look into these books that I've suggested. The books are they're excellent. They're such, when I was growing up and I would go and check out books from the library about UFOs, and there's just such a difference today in terms of the books that are available, because at that time it was like, kind of poor journalistic quality to the books that I read growing up, and just a lot of hearsay. But the books we have today are well researched, and some of them firsthand. And there's been a change in the quality of data and the quality of testimony about this topic that really warrant everybody to take a second look. And so I really encourage each one of us to do that. And I encourage each of one of us to strengthen our faith, because I think faith is an important thing for the human society to thrive. And I hope that our faith won't be left in the face of new discoveries and new technologies and enlightenments that may occur in the coming years. I think that we need to figure out how to integrate our faith with what's new, rather than have it disintegrate in the face of these things. Until next time, this is the Space for Faith podcast, and I'm your host, Matt, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening. Editing was performed by your host, Matt. Web hosting is by Spotify for podcasters. The intro music was Here For You by artist Ketsa, and the outro music was Quiet Outro by Rozakal. Both are licensed free to use with attribution and were found on Free Music Archive.